Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Just David here with my weekly message. I suppose I've not got anything particular to talk about this week, but as I was getting a sermon ready for Sunday, I noticed that the Old Testament reading was from the book of Job. And the thing is, you just get a little passage of it. We won't have it any other weeks because it's just one which happens to match the gospel that week. And so I thought I'd tell the story of the book of Job with a few sort of comments about it because it's one of the most interesting books in the Bible and one which sort of raises all sorts of interesting questions. But you kind of have to see the whole book, so you get, I say, a little glimpse out of it. The book of Job is in what's called the wisdom literature. And so one of the questions to ask about it is whether it's a sort of what do you call it, a parable, a story, or whether Job was a really real historical character. The trouble is that in it, as you'll see, Job is treated a bit like a lab rat. So it's a kind of fable, I suppose, a cautionary tale. And so if he was a real historical person, I mean, he seems to do quite badly, as it were, in this sort of experiment, as you'll see, that's carried on, this argument between God and the devil. If it's a cautionary tale, it kind of makes much more sense. But some people worry if you start saying things in the Bible aren't historically true. But then, so of course, lots of things in the Bible were never meant to be historically true. You can just tell a story. That's fine. I mean, if Jesus says, I don't know, a widow was looking for 10 coins. He doesn't mean there actually is a widow who historically was looking for 10 coins or whatever. It just means that, he's telling a story. So yeah, people can tell stories. Maybe the book of Job is a story. So what's the story of the book of Job? Because it's quite a long book and it's quite a sort of philosophically interesting book. So Job is a good man. He's a good and righteous man, and he's prosperous, and that's one of the questions of wisdom literature. Is it just that if you're good and behave yourself, you'll do well and be prosperous and rich? Because sometimes we think that, but then often there's, as we know in the world, actually there's lots of good, virtuous people who end up sort of pretty desperate. But anyway, Job is in that category of people who are doing very well, but also very nice, very good, very righteous. And God is in his counsel. He's having a bit of a ding dong with the devil, Satan, and he says, look at Job, what a great guy. It just shows you that there is righteousness, there are good men, and it's possible to lead a good life. And Satan says, well, yeah, I see that. He says, but, the only reason he's good and righteous is he's done very well for himself. I'm sure if you took away all the stuff from him, then, he would be sort of as venial and as debauched as the rest of them. And God says, okay, well, you can't hurt him, but take away kind of his wealth and his trappings, and so he'll still be praising me. He'll still be living a good and virtuous life. And so the Satan goes away and says, fine, fair enough. Makes him suffer quite a lot. Take away his riches and all the sort of trappings of prosperity. But Job doesn't flinch. Job carries on. Job is good and faithful and righteous and says, well, we've lost these things, but, well, that's, easy come, easy go. They're just possessions. And so Satan goes back to God and says, well, you win. But of course, he says, you haven't really let me get him. I mean, in the end, health is everything. If you took away, family, health, all the rest of it, he would then he would be cursing with the rest of them. And God says, okay, well, all right. And this to say is, God's response, whether it's a true story or not, becomes quite important, I think. And he says, okay. And so Satan goes away and takes everything that's dear to Job, his family, all the rest of it, and including his own health. So we have this picture of, Job sitting on a dunghill scraping at his sores. That's because, that's a really nasty kind of picture of suffering that God has given to Job. Anyway, so, but still, Job carries on and is good and righteous and refuses to curse God or in any other way sort of be diminished in his righteousness. And so then we meet Job's comforters. And it's a phrase that we use in English, isn't it? It should be Job's comforters. Job's comforters come along then with a sort of variety of excuses or explanations, and actually things that we might say, when we see suffering in the world, things that we might say to explain that suffering. The idea of justifying suffering in the world and God allowing suffering is a sort of whole theological discipline called theodicy. So, they come up with things that we hear people say. We do hear Job's comfort. So they come up with various things. One says, well, you've obviously done something wrong, Job. What is it that why have you got this? What are you, search your conscience. Just admit that you've done wrong. And I'm sure God will restore these things to you. And Job says, well, I really haven't. It's not false modesty. It's just I can't think of anything in particular. And God sort of backs him up with this. And then, another explanation is, well, God just isn't fair. Just curse God. It's really not fair, Job, that you're suffering in this way. Goodness me, what a terrible time. Yeah, you curse God along with the rest of us. Yeah. So they come up with these various explanations, and Job remains righteous. He says, no, I shall still praise God for his goodness, but I won't sort of be going to him as suppliants, sort of confessing all my sins, because, really I haven't done anything to deserve this. And, I don't want to admit things that I haven't done. And so basically the comforters go away. But then Job does kind of go into a lament and asks all the questions that we want to ask, really, about suffering. All the why questions. Why, God, has this happened to me? Actually, I haven't done anything wrong. And if I would admit it. And what I have done wrong, I admitted it. But, this is pretty pointless, this suffering. And I haven't deserved it. And where is justice? And where is, righteousness? Where's your righteousness in all of this? And then the bit we got on Sunday, which is just the little bit, is where God answers. And I put in inverted commas, because this is the difficult thing for theology. God never answers any of Job's questions. And I think that's kind of important, because it kind of says, Job's right. The what's called protest atheism, which is the kind of lamenting the injustice in the world, is quite right. That's something, when we see injustice, it's no good saying, it must be God's will somehow. Actually, when we see injustice, we ought to protest. We ought to point out that it's wrong, not say, somehow it's God's will. So God never answers Job's questions. However, God does, in a sense, answer, but his answers are basically saying, you can't see it from my perspective. Now, my problem with this is that this is a very bad thing to say when you're dealing in human relations. If one human says to another, and particularly a child, well, I've got my reasons, but I can't tell you about them, but I know I'm right. You think, that's, no, you haven't. You're just wrong. That's you don't know what I know, or you have not seen what I've seen, or, that from a human point of view, that's not good enough. If something has gone wrong, or, we ought to be able to explain why something has happened. But there is a sense, of course, in which that is true for God, that God has a kind of view from eternity. And as I said in the sermon, God may relieve suffering at certain points in our life, but obviously he's not going to always. He didn't for Jesus, he doesn't for St. Paul, he doesn't do for any of the apostles. And in the end, we all end up, frankly, dead. So it's not as though, God just allows us, if we behave ourselves, lives a wonderful life in eternity. No, we know. So there is a sense in which sort of God answers and doesn't answer. And then comes and really that's sort of the end of the story, except there's a little epilogue, and scholars debate about A, whether the epilogue belongs to the book, and also B, whether the epilogue makes the story better or worse. Because eventually, Satan says, okay, I admit it. He's a good chap, whatever you do to him. And so everything is restored to Job. He again makes a fortune. His health is restored. His family is restored, etc., etc. And he goes on to live a long and happy life. And as I say, some people say, well, is the trouble is, of course, to people who are suffering, that often doesn't happen. I mean, to victims of the Holocaust, to be rather sobering. It isn't as though they went through all this and then at the end of it, it was all okay. I mean, most of them just, that was the end of their lives. There wasn't any sort of justice. And so there's lots of questions in that book, and it is part of the wisdom literature, which is dealing with these questions of justice and righteousness and prosperity. If you're righteous, will you prosper? Not necessarily, but maybe. And if you don't prosper, having been righteous, where is the justice? And one of the questions, of course, is for Judaism at that time is there an afterlife? Is there a way in which okay, there isn't justice in this life? And plainly, as I say, using the example of the Holocaust and lots of other examples, there isn't justice in this life. It's not as though everybody goes to their deathbed, having their just desserts. I mean, some do, many don't, quite frankly. And so, one of the questions is there a sense in that justice is kind of goes beyond this? I don't think Job necessarily, a bit like God's, I don't think he necessarily answers all the questions. I think what it does very well is tell a story that kind of says, these are the questions that thoughtful people ought to be thinking about when they come to consider righteousness and God's justice as it relates to human beings in the world. So I don't think, you read the book of Job and say, all right, now I've read the book of Job, I've got the answers to these questions. But I think it's a very good story for raising the questions and to say, oh yeah, and to recognize, oh yes, I recognize Job's comforters. I recognize actually somebody who's a bit like Job. I recognize, and then encouraging sort of thought and discussion, debates, and coming to your own conclusions. So there we are. As I say, nothing particularly to do with what's in the news or anything else, but just a reflection on a really interesting book in the Bible, from which we heard a bit of a reading. You might have got on Sunday, but it wasn't live streamed, and not everybody has the Old Testament reading, so some of you might not have even heard that little snippet. So I thought I'd just give you a little sort of run through the book of Job, and not just the story, but also, those interesting questions it raises. Thank you.